Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 372 of my modded Factorio playthrough. In this episode, we are going to plan for a massive science expansion. Enjoy! So the next thing that we need to work on here is upgrading our science setup. The first research was alright. It was a little weird because it only required one science pack rather than two, when all the other stages require two science packs. But we'll need to do 400,000 times 2, 600,000 times 2, another 600,000 times 2, and yet another 600,000 times 2, and then the two big ones, 2 million times 2 of some of the packs, and then 2 million times 2 of most of the packs. Space science only needs the one, and for all of these we only need one pink science. We get a break there. And we have some choices here, because clearly this is not enough. And if we're going to do millions of science packs, essentially 8 million, doing 13 a second is no good. And even our massive snake of labs, about 2/3 of them aren't even populated now, because we can't pump out the science fast enough, and even this is probably not going to be enough labs. However, making science is potentially less difficult than it may seem. I did a test run here of just red and green science, and if we were to do this by belts, the very fastest that we could output this stuff is 75 a second, assuming each one got its own belt, which in itself is kind of problematic because that's not how the bus is designed, and there's not that many extra slots. In fact, there really aren't any. It would be difficult to get it in there, but stick with me here. Right now, what we want to do is get an idea for what is too much. What can the factory support? So I took the red and green science, and this isn't a build or anything. All we're doing is finding out the material input. So everything has been stacked with productivity modules that could get it. So of course some stages don't. And they've been broken down to their most barest resources. And in our case, it's coils. And it might surprise you that 75 of each of these science really doesn't require that much in coils. The most of it is iron. So let's bounce over to iron here. It's not currently running, but when we built it, it was designed around essentially 30 items a second, but now that we have faster machines, we could actually probably do 60. But where do those numbers come from? Well, iron and copper are the weird ones. They are twice as big as everything else. So there's 4 red belts of iron going in, which is 120 items a second. And when you I was like, why is there a belt missing? But it's because it's pulling it off into that depot, probably for all our concrete. But when you do the third tier, which is the highest tier of material processing, it doubles the output. So if 120 goes in, 240 comes out. And that's essentially what's going on here. The belts have been kind of piecemeal upgraded, but 4 belts went in and then 8 came out. 4 of them went up to go on the bus, and the other 4 were being turned into steel. So that's kind of how that math works. Everything else is 2 to 4 belts. So 60 items come in, 120 go out. And let's pick something that is quite simple, such as just straight tin. And you can see it has been designed around having its 4 belts of input, and it's slightly bigger than it needs to be. And then it goes into these coil machines, and the first tier of coils compresses it at a 4-to-1 ratio. So if 4 belts go in, 1 belt comes out. So since we have 120 going in, it means 30 come out. However, when they get chopped, well, if there weren't productivity modules, they would turn back into 120. However, with productivity modules, the sky's the limit. In fact, I can just straight up tell you, because if you stack a green machine, which is our highest tier with all productivities, looking down here, it's a 240% increase. If we have 120 times 3.4 for our 240% increase, that means we would get 408 plates a second. But it's even more than that, because if we use coolant, instead of requiring 160 molten tin going in, we only need 140. And that math is a little more annoying, but it's about a 14% increase on top of it. But for now, without things getting too complicated, let's just assume that every resource has its 4 belts of input, or 120, and then that would turn into 30 coils. So when you see things like 1.63 for tin, well, that's nothing considering we have 30 of an output. and also tinned copper wire, which is partially tin and partially copper. But you look at all these numbers and they're all pretty small. Now some of them are bigger. I mean, copper is certainly bigger, but the big one is the iron. But iron, in addition to many other materials, can be made into alloys. And our iron setup is actually pretty complicated here. We can make the iron with straight iron ingots. We can mix it at a 50-50 ratio with manganese. We can mix it with nickel and cobalt. And we also have one where we mix it with chrome and nickel. But to keep it simple, let's say manganese here. What this means is instead of having 4 belts going in and 4 belts going out, now 4 belts of iron go in and 8 belts of iron come out because only half of the input is actually iron, which means at our 4-to-1 ratio, it would be compressed into 2 belts of coils, or in other words, 60 items a second. So with very little extra effort, in fact no extra effort because it's already been done, we can put out 60 iron coils a second. So 8.1 is plenty doable, and it's actually quite easy to do. So that's the way of looking at it. Anything that can do alloys, such as titanium here, can spread its load. So it doesn't have to run on straight titanium, it can run on whatever else is available in the factory. It's the things that can't be alloyed, like lead, that you have to watch out for. Also, it's the things that are alloys in themselves, like cobalt steel here. There's no other way of doing this recipe. If we need cobalt steel, we need cobalt steel, and it's going to be in this ratio, where 12 cobalt and 24 steel go in, and we get 36 plates on the way out. It has to be in this ratio. So knowing that, we need to figure out how big can we make this setup with our factory size, and how long will it take to actually do that 2 million research? Because our factory is quite large, and we've already done all the work with this, basically preparing for today. It's been many episodes to get here, but I knew that in the future we would have to do a huge amount of construction, both in rockets and in research. And now we're here. But instead of building randomly, we actually need to figure out how big can we actually go. So we want to try to leverage all of this output the best we can without making any grievous errors. So for example, if we're rebuilding our science setup, it's going to be way bigger than this, and it's probably going to go all the way down here. It's going to be enormous. That would be bad if we thought it was going to be a certain size, and then we ended up building, let's say, 3 times too many of red and green science, and then we had to tear things out, and it would be weird. Also, we need to think of it logistically, because right now it's 1 item per bus slot, and our fastest belts are 75 items a second. So if it's going to be delivered on a bus like this, the most it can reasonably be is 75 items. Beyond that, it's going to need some other way of being delivered. And to an extent, we can do things differently, but only to an extent. So I've done the work ahead of time, checking out the monstrosity that is this. What this is doing is calculating the input resource requirement for all of the science that we're going to need. It's not a build, we're just figuring out the numbers. And a good starting point for this is 75 items a second, because that's the most that our belts can do. The only exception to this is that we only need half of that amount for the pink science, because this final research just only needs 1. And also note that it doesn't require any military science or any farming science at all, just these packs. So it's a little simpler in that sense. So one question we need to ask ourselves is, first of all, is 75 science a second reasonable for what we want to do? We're going to be doing 75 a second, and the researches leading up to this are not nearly as big as these two. So that's kind of what we want to figure out. Getting the space science is probably the easier part of this, because we're going to be launching rockets whenever they're ready to go, not when we actually need the science. So we could probably collect that 2 million science before we get to this point. Taking that out of the equation, then the limiting factor are these first 4 packs that we need 8 million of, and then we need a few more million of the other packs. So we might as well add these in here and just assume this as one big research block that we're going to have to go through 8 million packs. And it is true that we are making some packs that we don't need 8 million of, specifically the purple science and the pink science. So we could make this a little easier by cutting things like the purple science out, but when you look at the resources that go into it, it's actually nothing that's particularly crazy. These numbers look big, but remember, coils. Coils make things so much more dense. And doing pink, kind of the same way, where none of this stuff is particularly big. The expensive thing is gold science, with things like 259 titanium plates, 236 tungsten, 220 cobalt. So clearly gold is the hard one. When you look at our requirements here, gold is required for both of those big researches, so we might as well just add them all together. So we need 8 million science packs, but we don't actually have to make 8 million, because if we put 2 productivity modules in our labs, if you look down here, productivity is 80%, so we almost double the amount of science packs that we get. So the way that we can calculate this is do our planned 75 items a second times 1.8 for our productivity bonus, which means we'll actually be making, effectively, 135 science packs a second. And if our goal is 8 million, we can divide that by 135 to see that we need that many seconds. So divided by 60 gives us that many minutes, and again gives us that many hours. So we would need about 16 hours to effectively create our 8 million science packs. And that seems pretty reasonable, because if you remember, that's about the same amount of time that the rockets needed to make about 2,000 rockets, which would be required for our space science. So that fits that well. Now, one or the other will get done sooner, but the important thing to note is that they're both within range of each other. And that's all we're trying to do, is to make sure that our build isn't crazy. It's fine to be a little wrong with your ratios. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. There's no point in trying to make it perfect. You just want to basically try not to mess it up. I mean, isn't that life in general? Where your goal in life is not to mess things up. I suppose some people are real overachievers and want to be the very best, but I look at it as, I want to be good enough. I consider this factory, for what it needs to be, good enough. That was always my goal. It was never to be perfect. So coming back to our massive list here, we now know that 75 items a second for our output is logistically reasonable, and we'll also get what we need done in an acceptable time frame. So now the question is, are the input resources reasonable from a material standpoint and from a logistics standpoint? So first thing I did is just go through each science and made all the items required down to plate form, and I threw productivities in where they would go. So like on here, they don't fit on any of these. And a lot of these are that way, where you only put productivities in the final stage. But some of them do have inputs that can use the productivity, so they were all used when possible, which created huge plate numbers. And then after that, I also calculated the circuits requirement, because that's going to be an issue where we're going to need 154 of the brown circuits. However, the 55 of the white circuits and 71 of the green circuits are actually quite reasonable, so keeping up with those will be pretty easy. The brown ones, though, we're probably going to have to make those locally just to keep up, but these numbers are reasonable. And of course, they will also require their electronics components, which are just calculated there. Those would never be logistically delivered. They would be made on site, so those numbers are fine. And then after that, it's down to the plate choppers. And of course, plate choppers can use productivities. So this requirement, even with the productivities on the science packs, would require 606 copper plates a second. But stacked with productivities, then it goes down to only 44 coils a second. And copper is one of the big setups that can do 60 a second. It can't alloy anything, but our copper setup can do that. So then we want to look at the rest of these. Iron is quite small, tin is quite small, lead is quite small. In fact, all of these coils are like, well, that's easy. Even the tinned wire we can actually do 60 of right now. And the titanium sheet coils, that's a lot of titanium, but it's doable. The things that are difficult are the ones that aren't on this list at all, that are themselves alloys, and they don't come in coil form. They only come in their base form. And we can look at the numbers to figure it out. Now, we will also need lots of gases, like 1,500 naphtha a second, so certainly we would have to make this stuff. But compared to our rocket fuel setup that needed thousands and thousands of gases, this is nothing. We can do that. What we're looking for here is the crazy stuff. 264 glass a second. That is way too much glass to ever put on a bus. It's just too much. Because even with our 75 items a second, we would need to have 4 bus lanes just of glass. And of course, we couldn't even produce that. I'm sure with all our material technology, we could make that on a resource level, but getting it here, that's the hard part. Silicon is reasonable. That's a lot of plastic. Probably reasonable to have 2 belts of plastic if we really had to. It's kind of pushing it. We would need to have a second plastic setup in addition to the one we currently have in order to make that, but we could. Brass is not something worth worrying about. Cobalt steel, 230 a second. That's more cobalt steel than we're producing or could ever produce. At least at our current setup. Could we crank cobalt steel up higher? Yes, a third of the cobalt steel is cobalt itself, but the other 2/3 is regular steel. So 230 times 0.66 means we would need 151 ingots a second. And that's actually kind of bonkers because we're only doing 63. And that's with our entire factory's output of ingots. And steel is the weird thing where it's in iron form and then you turn it into steel form in ingot. And then to make the steel coils requires the steel ingots. You don't turn the iron ingots into steel coils. So we would need to have way more iron than this. But another thing is, could it be done? Kind of. Well, our factory right now uses iron from multiple sources, so we're actually only producing it with this one line of machines alone. And they're not even stacked with productivities. So when you look at its input, at most our factory can basically do 30 of each of these, which would turn into somewhere around 100 iron. So is this number theoretically doable? Probably. It depends on steel going into other things. And we are using 10.5 steel sheet coils, which would be some amount of steel. It could be mixed with other things. So at the least it would probably be, if the input there normally would be 40, it'd probably be around 13 ingots a second or so. So at the extreme, theoretically could we do it? Probably. That would really push it, but probably. Besides space, there's nothing stopping us from just doubling up or quadrupling up different ore processing types. We would have to get the belts in here, which would be kind of annoying because the bus kind of goes from left to right. But could it be done? Sure. We've got extra bus slots that aren't being used for anything, so we could always loop them around, send them back this way, or just loop them around the top and just directly into their warehouse. So that's pushing it, but it's possible. Silicon nitride at 110, that's fine. We're actually kind of short on it now for rockets, and that's the other thing about this, that launching rockets and researching the science are probably mutually incompatible with each other in the sense that they're going to share a lot of the same resources, so we can't expect both of them to run at full power all the time, but they won't have to, because the rockets will only have to launch up until the point that we've launched all the spaceship parts and acquired all of the science packs. After that, the science bus can use everything. So that number is okay. Needs some batteries. Another tricky part here is tungsten powder at 220. We did just upgrade this, so now it gets the same benefit as everything else. So 60 goes in and 120 comes out. But it's also an issue because we need pretty much the same amount of tungsten plates. And the tungsten plates are also made from the powder. Could we build a second one? Yeah, sure. I mean, it would even fit in this same spot if we just move some belts around. There's certainly room for it. And if we upgraded these belts to be 60 items a second, it would work. So really the only limiting factor is the actual tungsten production right here, which a lot goes into it. But an advantage of using multiple types of input resources is it stresses each one less. So could we double this and have, let's say, 40 items a second of these purified tier 4 crystals going in? Sure. It's probably really going to push the factory, and this is all what we're checking here, is all of this is going to stress the factory. But is it possible, and is it reasonable? Sure. It's right on the limit again, but possible. A little bit of wood, a little bit of stone bricks, and now we're starting to get into stuff that's easy, like paper, some amount of carbon. So yeah, these numbers are reasonable. The limiting factor here is cobalt, to a lesser extent silicon nitride, and basically tungsten, both from a production standpoint, as we've already talked about, but also delivery, and of course the glass too. We are not going to be able to dedicate, what is this, 16 bus slots to all of these items. It's just too much. We would have to deliver it in other ways. So could we? Probably. Especially because this is a major drone path, and in fact, there's even a really annoying drone path that's right in front of the bus here. We might want to move it down here just so it's out of the way. But it exists. And drones are fantastic for this, and in fact that's a gold coil drone right there, because this was the closest place to put gold coils on, so we're even taking advantage of that now. So yes, if we built the setups here and extended out going this way using this entire area that's been earmarked for this, there would be a drone path above and below. And yes, it would really stress drones, but it's a lot easier. So let's say we built our setups based on one belt each. Well, if we look at our input requirements, all of this stuff is going into gold science, where let's say we built 4 of these, and each one had a drone depot delivering 1 belt of titanium, delivering 1 belt of tungsten, 1 belt of cobalt, and 1 belt of the powder. Sure, and then we just have 4 of them, and the depots would just make requests. And then the one that's a little weird is blue science, because it uses a ton of glass on 2 different stages here. So it would need to be split into 4ths as well. But it's possible, and now we're starting to find solutions to our logistic issues. And that's kind of what we're looking at here, is just to make sure before we even get started on this, A, is it possible? And B, how is it possible? And yeah, it's doable. It's going to require some expansions to certain parts of the factory, but other parts of the factory won't even care. Like gold won't care, titanium won't care, silver won't care, copper will be stressed. Tin to a lesser extent, but like lead won't care. Aluminum, slightly stressed, but it's actually kind of interesting that as much as this is, a lot of the factory is actually not really going to care about this load here. All right, well, we now have a new build to do, and luckily, because this is staggered, we can focus on essentially 1 science pack at a time. Although, since we already did this first one, we're going to be doing red and green at the same time. But also red and green are the easy ones. So we can use this build here that already has the numbers in here. So now we can actually change these numbers for the purposes of actually making the build. So now we want to focus on the intermediate elements of this. Are any of them extreme? As long as all of them are below 75, then no. And if you look at all of this, they are all below 75, which means there are no logistical issues to this, and we can just compress everything down as far as it'll go. And is it reasonable to have 1 machine doing this? That's actually kind of funny. 1 machine going into 158. I guess that's what happens when you have 1 stacked with productivities and the other one stacked with speed modules. But yeah, that's totally reasonable numbers. Although from a logistics standpoint, it might be a lot easier to do this if we just do some direct insertion. Because if we only have 3 plate choppers, then why not just have the 3 assembling machines and not even have the intermediate belt at all? So we really only need the 1 speed module, and then we can clean the machine up, and that's all we need. So kind of the same thing with the copper element here, where we need to get it to below 2, and that takes 2 speed modules, and then we clean the machine up, so those will be direct inserted. And that's the red setup. The only limiting factor now is just how big it is, but it can go anywhere. Okay, now we need to do the green, and it's a little more wild. First of all, if we want to back out to this other one, it is going to require some amount of basic circuit boards. But that is a reasonable amount of circuit boards to deliver, and they're already being delivered there, compared to the blue science, which essentially is going to have to make its own boards because it's just too much. So this does make this a little easier because we can remove the boards. And now we're just looking at intermediates again. Are any of these numbers too crazy? Not really. The big one is the iron, but it's still within 1 belt. So if we wanted to belt all this stuff, we totally could. But again, is direct insertion possible to make this a lot easier? Kind of, and to an extent, a little more complicated, but certainly this goes into this, which goes into this, which goes into this, and they're all 1-to-1. So we can go straight up the line for that element of it. And actually below 1 works out pretty well because at least we can flank it with 2 machines, and then that would actually work. This would require the boards, which would come from the bus, and then it would be flanked by the tin plate machines, which we would have 2 of. So we just put the speed modules in there necessary to get us to that point. So we kind of want to do basically the same thing with every machine now, because this one would require the copper, which is the same. It would be flanked by 2 machines with direct insertion. The lead, which is only used here, would be the same way. And this iron one is a little different. It needs more machines. So this is actually a situation where we might actually want to put 2 of these choppers in here, because if we move this up to above where the second one requires its resources, it will only process them for the stage that's above it. So by moving it up here, it's not including this, so we can see what we would need. And unfortunately, it's slightly above 2. If we take 2 of the productivity modules out, we still maintain a huge amount of productivity, but now the speed modules are coming into play, and we would need a lot less. So is it worth it doing that, where it would be 4.25 compared to 3.25? I kind of do want them all to more or less be the same. I think it'd just be cooler if this went into this, went into this, went into this, and all 4 of those stages basically looked exactly the same. Even though our material efficiency is slightly less, it is just iron coils, which are not difficult. Now that we've split that apart, we can chop the plates a second time, and I guess I'll move it up so it's a little easier to understand. But now we have this final machine here, which, like the other ones, can be buffed to requiring just one machine. And its plate chopper is like the other ones now, where it would be flanked one on each side. So this is pretty cool. It's going to be one assembling machine in the middle, flanked by 2 plate choppers for basically every stage. Some of them will get input resources from other places. And none of these numbers are particularly crazy, so it's all quite doable. And then, of course, we have the massive amount of assembling machines. Let's actually start with green first, since it's going to be the limiting factor. And I'm just going to remove all this for now, so we just see this. And even more silos are getting to stage 6, because they're all consolidating their resources. In fact, most of them are there now. I don't want to go there and do this with the character because it's going to trash our inventory. Oh, well, there we go. They all basically instantly switched to 6 because all those resources were being injected in. But now they're all going into the junk warehouse to be dealt with later. And in fact, maybe we don't deal with them, we just leave them in the junk warehouses, because then, if we need more silos, they will instantly be available. And that's the end of this episode. On the next one, we are going to start to implement our science expansion plans, starting with red and green science. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.